Hello landlords, Joy here. Today let's talk about 5 clauses every landlord should include in their lease agreements. These may not be so obvious, but they are guaranteed to save you money when dealing with crafty renters. The first clause to include in your lease is the most important. It is an application of funds clause. This statement gives the landlord the ability to deduct certain charges from a rent payment. It simply states landlord may apply funds received from tenant first to any non-rent obligation of tenant, including but not limited to late charges, returned payment charges, repairs, damage caused by pets, periodic utilities, animal charges, and then to rent. Essentially, this means that if your tenant breaks something or incurs a lease violation or default and refuses to reimburse you, you may collect this amount from a rent payment and apply it towards said monetary infraction. This in turn, of course, will create a balance still owed for rent. The landlord will then inform the tenant that rent was not paid in full because you have applied your deductions. The tenant must then pay the remaining balance. Having an application of funds statement in your lease will make the tenant financially responsible for any damages they cause, saving you from footing the bill. The second clause that is very often overlooked in leases is who handles lawn care. Whether you intend to have the tenant responsible for yard maintenance or do this yourself, this needs to be spelled out in great detail in the lease. When I first started landlording, I made the huge mistake of orally communicating with my tenant that she needed to take care of such duties. What a ridiculous thing to do! Needless to say, this did not work out well for me. Also, because I was a novice, I did not recognize that my lease was silent regarding such matters. This is a terrible mistake to make. Lawn care is a big deal because lawn service can be pricey, and the lease needs to spell out exactly what is expected of your tenant. If such details are not clearly stated, the tenant can easily take matters into their own hands. Ignore your rules and your lawn, and there'll be nothing you can do about it. Having a clear and written designation of yard duties can save you money if your tenant is on the hook for lawn care. The third provision to include is what to do about abandoned property. If you landlord long enough, dealing with leftover or unwanted belongings will happen to you. How do you want to handle this? Some states have specific stipulations regarding these matters, but it is always best to spell out your procedures in your lease so there are no surprises when this occurs. Some laws require that you hold onto tenants' belongings for a specific amount of time or store the items, and some laws require that you attempt to notify the tenant and inquire about said belongings. But if you have an abandoned property clause that details what you, the landlord, will do and how soon you will do it, spelled out in your lease, this will take precedence. Sometimes your tenant will leave property behind on purpose, making you responsible for removing it for them, so have a plan in writing. Oftentimes you can and should charge the tenant for removing or storing said unwanted articles. The fourth essential lease clause I have adopted is that of an early termination or lease cancellation stipulation. I have learned very quickly that despite signing a legal binding agreement, some tenants just don't care, and they think I will somehow allow them an exception. Why would I do that? I now require a fee. 2 months rent if the tenant decides to bail on the lease for reasons that are not protected under my state laws. Including a lease cancellation fee will save you a lot of money when it comes to turning over the property and putting it back on the market without worrying about lost revenue from time off the market. And I feel that 2 months rent is actually a fair amount. This fee may also be a deterrent for any tenant who believes walking away from a lease has no consequences. And the last essential lease clause I swear by is non-refundable security deposit clause. I once had a tenant rent my place sight unseen. In retrospect, this was a terrible idea for both parties. My tenant immediately complained about the color of the front door, the rose bushes in my front yard, and the very scary squirrels in the backyard. She was a very unhappy camper, and so was I. Never again will I rent my place sight unseen. In the end, I readily agreed to let her out of the lease, but instead of just walking away and realizing that I was actually doing her a favor by releasing her without penalty, she demanded that I also return her security deposit in full. Needless to say, I declined. She did leave, but after looking at my lease and the law, I found that I did have to return a portion of her deposit because no such provision existed in my lease allowing me to keep it. and I quickly learned that if this language is not in my lease, the landlord is obligated to return the deposit, even if the tenant breaks the lease for no good reason. This sounded crazy to me because I know that turning over property does incur some costs, even if the tenant stays for only a short time. I still needed to pay for cleaning and utility charges and travel for showings. I immediately drafted a security deposit clause that states that if the lease is terminated without reasons protected under my state law, the tenant will forfeit the security deposit. Having this clause in your lease can save you thousands when it comes to dealing with persnickety tenants. Hope this was helpful, fellow landlords.